Nathan, how do you pronounce your last name? Weissman?
Weissman.
Weissman?
Yeah, just imagine it were written in German. Then
okay.
It's the phonetically correct spelling in Polish of the Yiddish name. So it all gets very good.
And Travis, it's Libert?
Libert.
Libert. Great, thanks. Andrew, I think I got yours. Cosimo, I got yours.
Yeah, hello everyone. Good afternoon.
Is that Karsten?
And hello from the US. It's pretty early here, but glad to be here.
Hi, Keith.
Hey.
Weather in Colorado. Are you in Colorado?
Yeah,
Bob, we can start. We're live.
We're live. Okay. Well, everyone, welcome to this TripSet 25 webinar, The Economics of Intellectual Property, Trade-Related Perspectives. This webinar forms a part of a series of events to mark the 25th anniversary of the WTO Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, TRIPS. Webinar follows a seminar on trade and knowledge held April 20th and delves more deeply into deepening and transformation of thinking and a rich diversity of practical experience and indeed measurable data concerning the interplay between the IP system and trade and broader issues such as knowledge spillovers and their contribution to development. The webinar also draws on some substantive papers to be published shortly in a forthcoming volume, Trade and Knowledge by Cambridge University Press. The panelists, who I'll introduce briefly here in a minute, include renowned intellectual scholars and the chief economist from the World Intellectual Property Organization, the EU Intellectual Property Office, and the US Patent and Trademark Office. We're going to discuss the economic and statistical issues stemming from the growth of cross-border trade and knowledge associated with TRIPS implementation, including the challenges of measuring of trade and IP, modeling the interaction of IP protection with trade and economic development. And the idea is to generate fresh conversation about insights and possibilities of economic analysis for better understanding the policy significance of the IP system in the world economy. So we'll have 6 speakers: Karsten Fink, Chief Economist of WIPO, Cosimo Beverelli, an economist here in the Economic Research and Statistics Division at the WTO, Keith Maskus, Professor in the Economics Department at the University of Colorado, Nathan Weissman, Chief Economist for the European Union Intellectual Property Office, Andrew Toll, Chief Economist, US Patent and Trademark Office, and then Travis Libert, Professor, Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at UC Davis. They have their full bios in the materials found online, so I won't say any more than that. The order will be the order that I just described them in, and we'll start, each speaker will have about 15 minutes. We'll start with Karsten, who's going to talk about the geography of innovation, local hotspots, and global networks. So about 15 minutes, and I will come in if you go much beyond that and say, okay, time to move on. Karsten, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Bob, for this kind introduction. And maybe we should say happy birthday to the TRIPS agreement, maybe congratulate the WTO for 25 exciting years. And TRIPS is, of course, much in the news these days. So it's, of course, a highly relevant agreement. There is a lot that one could potentially talk about. I chose the theme of geography, partly because we published a report 2 years ago, and this was just before the pandemic, and we had planned all these events where we could present the report, and we had to cancel all of these events. And I think the report is interesting. Also, we invested in a lot of data, a lot of patent data that I think many people are not necessarily familiar with. And I just, wanted to just say a few words about this. Now, what I ideally like to do is share my screen, and let's see if that works. Okay, I have a slight tricky issue. I just need to give permission here, if you bear with me for 1 minute.
I'll let you know when we can see your screen, okay?
Yes. Screen. Okay. Right. Screen recording. Yes. Screen share. Okay, I'll give it one more try. If not, I'm just going to talk. There we go. I think that. There we go. Can you see that?
We can indeed.
Okay. Let me just go ahead here. Yeah, so this is, in a sense, our foray into economic geography. And geography is, of course, highly relevant. I think in trade terms, when one often talks about the geography of trade, the country is the unit of analysis. But of course, there is geography within countries, and that geography is quite important. It's quite important for traditional questions of trade, but it is, as we argue in our report, it's really important for understanding how the world of innovation works. So what we do in this report is, we're essentially trying to map out where innovation takes place and how innovation around the world, how it is connected. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the economic literature on geography, are mindful of the fact that what one tries to do with economic geography is one tries to explain how economic activity is distributed across space. Traditionally, economies of scale and scope and transport cost savings have been at the center of analysis. Arguably, in the innovation-driven economies of the 21st century, there are other forces that are key and that explain why innovative activity really center around urban agglomerations, or in short, cities. Cities is, of course, where companies find skilled workers. Skilled workers, in turn, move to cities because that's where they find well-paying jobs and they value the amenities of metropolitan life. Cities are also the most fertile places for ideas to flourish as innovators work in close proximity of one another. And I think that is fairly familiar to economic geographists. Now, the economic geography of the 21st century has, of course, another important dimension. Technology has increasingly facilitated knowledge flows over long distances. And there is, of course, a long history of scientific collaboration among researchers working at different universities and, of course, sometimes in different countries. Also, as part of the production fragmentation process that trade economists have so well described, that indeed has given rise to global value chains, multinational companies have also spread their research and development activities to different places to optimize their innovation impact. So these two forces of urban agglomeration and dispersion have given rise to what we call global innovation networks. And this is just an illustration. The main objective of our research that led to the report was essentially to take a look inside these global innovation networks to better understand who participates in them and how they have evolved over the past few decades. Now, how did we do this? And this is in a sense where the data that we used in our research are really interesting. So quite naturally, as the World Intellectual Property Organization, we first tend to look at patents when trying to understand innovation trends. So here's an example of the first page of a patent filed under WIPO's PCT treaty. And what you see in these red rectangles is essentially the rich bibliographic information provided in patent applications. So we have information on when a patent was filed, we have information on the applicant or owner of the patent, and we have information on the individual inventors who contributed to a particular invention that underlies a patent. We also have the postal address for each inventor, In other words, patents really give us a window into technological invention across time and space. And the same holds for scientific publishing activities. So that was the other major data source we drew on. Articles published in scientific journals come with a publication date and, of course, a list of authors, their institutional affiliation, and in many cases, their postal addresses. So we worked with data in the case of patents from 1970 to 2017, covering essentially every patent office around the world for which data are available. In total, these are around 9 million patent families covering more than 22 million inventors. And we were able to essentially geolocate the location of the inventors up to the rooftop level for pretty much all of these inventors. In the case of scientific publishing data, again, it's a huge database, over 24 million scientific articles between 1998 to 2007, actually just under 24 million scientific articles, covering close to 63 million scientific authors. And again, we, in this case, geocoded mostly at the postal code level or the sub-city level. And essentially, what I'm going to do here in the limited time I have is I'm just going to present to you a few descriptives that essentially already tell quite an interesting story about these global innovation networks. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that we see that innovation is increasingly local. Now, what we do, how we see this is we essentially engage in density-based spatial clustering. So think of a map where each inventor and each scientific author is represented by a dot, and that we then take a magnifying lens and we spot the areas where there is the greatest concentration of dots under the magnifying lens. These days, of course, there are computer algorithms that can perform this job on large quantities of data. And we then make a distinction between what we call global innovation hotspots, which are the areas with the greatest innovation density. And we also identify so-called specialized niche clusters, which don't meet the standards of global innovation hotspots, but which show innovation density that is particularly high in one more field of patenting or scientific publication. So as the two examples here, I have, of course, the Silicon Valley as a global innovation hotspot, and here in Switzerland, a specialized niche cluster involving the areas of Neuchâtel, Fribourg, Biel, and Bern. Now, if in a sense I want to look at all the hotspots and niche clusters around the world, you can see them on this map here. They are heavily concentrated, of course, in a few world regions: North America, Western Europe, and East Asia. And aside from China, there are far fewer hotspots in middle-income economies. There's some in India and Brazil. The African continent does not have any area with sufficient innovation density to qualify as a global innovation hotspots, though we do find a number of specialized niche clusters on the African continent. Now, we find that global innovation hotspots in particular play an outsized role in the global innovation landscapes, and especially so the top hotspots. So if one only looks at the 30 metropolitan hotspots around the world, they accounted for 69% of patents and 48% of scientific activity in essentially the most recent period. And they're mostly located in only 5 countries: China, Germany, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and the United States of America. The short story here is that innovation is highly geographically concentrated. Not only that most innovation takes place in relatively few countries, within those countries, it also takes place in a limited set of metropolitan areas. Second point I want to make is that collaboration is rising. This is something that we find in our data. What we observe in our data is how many inventors contribute to invention, to a particular invention, and in the case of scientific publications, how many authors contribute to a scientific article. And what we find there is that the role of single inventors and single scientific authors has diminished, and at the same time, teams of growing size are becoming more and more important. And that's especially striking in the case of scientific research, where more than 1/5 of scientific publication has 6 or more authors. There are probably several explanations for this trend, but we believe that one important one is growing technological complexity. You need more and more researchers with more specialized knowledge to solve increasingly difficult problems. We also find, and that's our third finding, and that's closely associated to the one I just presented, is that we see that international collaboration is on the rise. So if you compare the period 1998 to 2000 with the period 2011 to 2015, we see more international co-inventorships, both in terms of numbers as well as bilateral collaboration pairs. And the intensity of international collaboration is even more pronounced for international scientific collaboration, as shown in these graphs. Now, we also analyzed, and that also I think is quite an interesting finding, who drives international collaboration. And we found that once more, these global innovation hotspots, these 30-odd hotspots I pointed to earlier, play an outsized role. So the top 10 collaborative hotspots alone, the Silicon Valley, New York, Frankfurt, Tokyo, Boston, Shanghai, London, Beijing, Bengaluru, and Paris, account for 22% of all international co-inventions. And if one calculates the centrality of these collaboration ties, and we have some technical measures for that, don't have time to go into that, we find that the US hotspots and clusters emerge as the most central ones. So there is, in a sense, something special about the US innovation system in the world, in that a lot of collaboration ties essentially go through US universities and US companies. We have a fourth finding on multinational companies that lie at the center of global innovation networks. And now I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Just a word of data here. So the great thing about patent data is, as I mentioned, you not only have information on the applicant, you also have information on the inventors, and you have the location of the inventors. And in this particular example here, you're looking at a Siemens application. So the applicant is based in Germany, but you see inventors that are partly located in Germany and partly located in Russia. And again, we can essentially, put all that information together for all the patents we have data on, and we can essentially draw a map of what we call international patent sourcing, where essentially a company relies on inventors that are located in a different country. And in a nutshell, what we see is that this patent sourcing has greatly increased. It used to be confined mainly to the set of high-income countries, but quite remarkably, it includes more and more middle-income economies, and especially China and India really emerge as important locations for inventors that you would find in patents that are filed by multinational companies. Just want to end with a few policy perspectives. We do make a case, and I hope our WTO friends will appreciate this, for openness, for the gains, the mutual gains from openness in this domain. And that is partly based on specialization. There's a whole economic literature that sort of looks at how openness in the area of innovation contributes to growth, and we review this. We also make a strong case for openness, especially against the backdrop of mounting evidence of falling research and development productivity. So there is essentially a growing literature that shows that it takes more and more R&D effort to achieve the same level of technological progress as in the past. So if one, for example, looks at this famous Moore's law that predicts that the number of transistors on a microchip will double every 2 years, that law still holds, but compared to the 1970s, the resources of the R&D resources that go into that have multiplied by a factor of 18. So we can still achieve progress, but it takes a lot more input to achieve that progress. So against that background, we argue that greater diversity and specialization in the pursuit of innovation is important, and that's precisely what openness and international collaboration can offer. We also make a case for international cooperation. I will skip this a little bit, but the final point that I want to make is that this emergence of global innovation network has, of course, coincided with growing regional divergences of incomes, skills, and employment opportunities within countries. And we see that in a number of jurisdictions. In the United States and Europe, for example, there's evidence of regional income convergence up to the 1980s, 90s, but over the last 2 or 3 decades, regional incomes have essentially diverged. And you could argue that, in a sense, these global innovation hotspots, have amplified this phenomenon. They have, in a sense, attracted skills to the urban agglomerations. And, as probably the prime example of that, we looked at Tel Aviv, which is one of the global innovation hotspots. And it's interesting that, in the case of Tel Aviv, it accounts for 77% of essentially all startups and 60% of high-tech jobs. But wages in the peripheral regions are 35% lower than in central Israel. And you essentially see this divergence then in terms of economic outcomes. And this, of course, I think is something that's very important to address from a policy-making perspective. So, and in making openness work, it's not only important in some sense to allow openness or allow international collaboration to happen. It's also important in a sense to prevent these kinds of regional divergences, essentially undermining the case for openness. Let me stop here. I think I went a little bit over time. I'd also be happy to talk a little bit, what we're up to these days. Maybe later on we can have an exchange of what may be some interesting research opportunities as we go forward. But I don't want to abuse my first mover advantage here and just hand the microphone back to Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Carsten, for that concise but powerful presentation. Some really important insights there, and your closing point about the growing inequality subnationally as being a real challenge. This was something we've seen in the trade field for a long time. And years ago, I worked in rural development for a while and in the United States, and it was a real challenge then, and it's not one that we've really fixed very well. In fact, we've probably gone in the wrong direction after not making enough progress earlier. So important questions there. Thank you, Carsten. And there's already some question in the chat for you, but we'll come back to it, okay? So thanks for keeping to time and a concise presentation. Now I'd like to move to Cosimo Beverelli. Cosimo is going to talk about IPR regulation positively affecting innovation, being an open question, both in traditional and digital markets. Cosimo, the floor is yours. You have about 15 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, everybody. So this presentation is going to be centered about the impact of international property rights on innovation, and it draws from a section in the Water Report 2020, which was more broadly about the determinants of innovation, and in particular of digital innovation. Stronger intellectual property rights, IPRs, in this presentation, the protection of IPRs stimulates technology transfer through the channel of FDI, and there is a breach of an abundant evidence for this. However, the impact on domestic innovation of stronger IPR protection is ambiguous. In particular, we don't have good evidence and only indirect evidence that patent disclosure, that is the requirement to disclose the invention in exchange for the patent right, has any impact on research investment. And also, you might think that the stronger IPR protection has a positive impact on follow-up innovation, that is the innovation that builds on the existing patents, but the evidence for this is mixed. Some papers find a positive impact of IPRs on follow-up innovation, but some equally good papers do not find any such impact. So the conclusion from this review of this literature is that chemicals, and in particular the pharmaceutical sector, is the only sector for which there is good evidence that from the perspective of firms, patents are essential in spurring R&D investment. So there are quite a few good studies that have found that patent protection positively affects the availability of new drugs. For instance, Kyle and Quian 2014 and Batal and Dai 2019 WTO working paper show that in the absence of a patent, drug launch is unlikely. And similarly, Cockburn et al. 2016 show that longer and more extensive patent rights tend to shorten the time span before new drugs become commercially available. In the Water report, we also discussed the impact of compulsory licensing, so I'm gonna distinguish between theoretical impact and empirical evidence. So compulsory licensing can, in theory, impact innovation both in the licensing country and in the foreign country, that is the country of origin of the inventors whose patents were licensed. And in both cases, the theoretical impact is ambiguous. So why is it ambiguous in the licensing country? Well, because on the one hand, domestic innovation might be reduced if access to foreign owned technologies displaces domestic R&D. That is, if domestic R&D and foreign technologies are substitutes, or the R&D embodied in foreign technologies are substitutes, or on the other hand, invention in the licensing country could increase if access to foreign inventions complements domestic R&D. And what is the impact in the country of the inventors whose patents were licensed? Well, also the impact here is theoretically ambiguous because on the one hand, compulsory licensing may discourage long-run innovation by reducing the expected effectiveness of patents because they get expropriated to a certain extent. But on the other hand, it might also foster innovation by increasing the threat of competition, owing to the well-known innovation increasing effect of competition. So what does the empirical evidence tell us? Well, there are very few available empirical studies, and they all show a net positive impact of compulsory licensing on invention, both in the licensing country and in the country of investors. So in particular, the literature is extremely sparse here. So I could find a paper by Moser and Vena, 2012, that showed that an episode of extensive compulsory licensing under the US Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 led to a 20% increase in patenting activity of US inventors in organic chemistry. So this is a confirmation that compulsory licensing can act to increase inventions in the country that engages in compulsory licensing. And using the same data, Baton, Bianchi, and Moser 2017 studied the impact of the same episode of compulsory licensing on patenting activity by German firms, the firms whose patents were expropriated. And they showed that German firms whose patents were licensed increased their R&D effort by 89% in fields with licensing. So they also find, actually in this case, very strong evidence that compulsory licensing can increase innovation in the foreign country, in the country of origin of expropriated inventors. Now, a big caveat here, the results of these two studies, these are two excellent studies, very well published. However, they refer to the exceptional case of expropriation of an entire nation's patent portfolio during a wartime during the First World War. And I couldn't find any papers about the innovation impact of more limited forms of compulsory licensing that are more in line with current practice. So in this particular area, further research is not only welcome, but really necessary. Now, in the next few minutes, I will concentrate on the impact of intellectual property rights on digital innovation, which was the focus of last year's work report. So there is a lot of literature on the impact of IPRs on innovation in traditional industries, in particular in pharmaceuticals, but there is very sparse literature on the impact of IPRs on digital innovation. So due to the absence of evidence, let's start with the stylized fact. The stylized fact is that of a positive unconditional correlation between ICT patents, patents in ICT sectors, which is an outcome measure of digital innovation, and the country-level IPR protection. And this positive correlation is obtained in a cross-section of 91 countries at different levels of economic development. So here you can see the positive correlation. On the vertical axis, you have the share of ICT patents in total patents. That is in the number of patents filed under the WIPO PCT by the inventor's country of residence. And the horizontal axis, you have a country-level measure of IPR protection sourced from International Property Rights Alliance. And so this begs the question of what drives this apparently positive correlation between intellectual property right protection and digital innovation. So first of all, one has to clarify what does IPR protection, what does IPR protection look like in the digital era? So in the digital era, in the digital economy, IPR protection takes the form of patents, trademarks, copyright, legal protection about the circumvention of technological protection measures, or the removal of digital rights management information. I will not touch upon all these forms of intellectual property right protection. I will discuss in particular copyrights, for which there is some literature. So copyright law is expected to become more important than in the past because many digital products are replicable at zero cost and are of a non-rival nature. And research by Giorcelli and Moser, which just came out last year, shows that weak enforcement of copyright can lead to lower revenues in industries where copyrights matter, such as the music, film and publishing industries. However, one has to recognize that digital technologies greatly reduce the cost of creating, promoting, and distributing creative output. So digital technologies boost the inventiveness of talented people and boost the capacities of talented people to create and promote their own cultural products. And research by Waldvogel and co-authors in a series of papers has shown that digital technologies might even have contributed to an increase in the quality of music, books, and movies. For instance, because independent labels play a growing role in the music industry. So on the one hand, digital technologies may enable weak enforcement of copyright because music might be more music, film, and other creative output might be more easy replicable and distributable. On the other hand, it might have contributed to an increase in the quality of these creative products. Another very hotly debated issue is the impact of patent tickets. So what are patent tickets? They are dense webs of overlapping IPRs as defined by a famous competition economist, Carl Shapiro. It is estimated, for instance, that a smartphone is covered by 250,000 patents. So in theory, patent tickets might stifle innovation because it might be impossible to engage in follow-up innovation. However, and here too, I could only find one paper showing this, and more research is welcome. Noel and Shankerman, 2013, find that greater fragmentation of patent rights is associated on the one hand with lower market value, but on the other hand with higher levels of patenting and R&D by software firms. So the received wisdom that patent tickets might stifle digital innovation is actually not borne in the data. And finally, in the report, we also look at the impact of open source software. So what is open source software is a digital public good where intellectual property protection serves the purpose of keeping the project non-excludable. So you can think of all the creative licenses, that's exactly what they do. And due to the non-rival and non-excludable nature of open source software and to the immediate online availability of new code, high quality open source contributions can be widely, immediately adopted worldwide. And there is anecdotal evidence that open source software is very important for digital innovation. And I would say it is essential because it enables the structure, the infrastructure that is necessary for digital innovation. And here I can provide an illuminating example. In 2019, all of the fastest 500 supercomputers in the world and 96.3% of the world's top 1 million servers, and also 90% of all cloud infrastructure were using the open source Linux operating system. Without it, we couldn't have the type of research that Carsten was mentioning, this international collaborative research, because research is done with big data, is done in international teams, and is done in servers. So open source software is essential for the type of research that characterizes the digital economy. So I think I used less time than my 15 minutes, but that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Cosimo. Right on time, actually. So your review of the literature suggests that economists still struggle trying to figure out what the sort of effects of IPR on, whether it's in traditional markets or digital markets. This has, I think, been something that's been fairly long-standing. And I think our next speaker, Professor Maskus, has at least bilaterally shared that perspective with me historically. It's been a while since we've talked to Keith. So why don't we go ahead and hear from Keith. He's going to talk about global knowledge flows, absorptive capacity, and capability acquisition, old ideas, recent evidence, and new approaches. So Keith, perhaps you've got some new insights here for us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that that introduction. I'm having a hard time sharing my screen here because it says I can't do that while the other participant is sharing. So
Okay,
okay, there we go. Thank you.
there you go.
Let's see here.
And now we have it.
Great. So I just want to start with a couple of observations. In putting these slides together, I was thinking about my past participation in these conferences, and indeed I've found some old slides from the trips at 10 conference and the trips at several trips at 20 conferences, and now we're looking at trips at 25, so happy birthday trips in the WTO. I hope that these institutions become a little bit more reinvigorated going forward. But it's kind of remarkable how similar the questions remain over that period of time. I do think we know a lot more now at the trips of 25 benchmark than perhaps even 5 years ago. And I would say that's because of the ability to bring micro data into these questions in the way you saw with that remarkable presentation by Carsten and what his colleagues are doing at WIPO on global innovation networks. So with that background, let me just tell you what I'm going to do. I mean, I've got a simpler title here, which is basically going to be about what do we know from recent research about things involving intellectual property protection as an institutional matter, patenting as it correlates with trade, and technology transfer. So that's basically what I've been working on for a long time, and many others now as well. And let me just start here with just telling you that, as you all know, intellectual property protection is in principle important for a great many things. It is frustrating, as you just saw Cosimo, frustrating that it's so difficult to find the smoking gun that suggests that IP rights and specifically patent rights have a strong and identifiable impact on innovation. That's been a question for many decades now. But I think, as was mentioned at the beginning of his talk, we have pretty good evidence that that intellectual property institutions have a pretty strong effect on technology transfer, trade, FDI, and all of that. The rest of these issues you see in this first set of bullet points there are a little, not as well understood in the global economy. And I think in particular, where we're falling short so far is in trying to understand how global reforms in IP, whether that's patents, copyrights, trade secrets, whatever it is, how that generates changes in the valuation of knowledge assets, as has been remarked by many scholars and practitioners. The global stock of knowledge assets surely exceeds that of physical assets now in terms of production materials. And yet we know relatively little about the correlations involved here. So plenty of research ahead of us. Time is short, so I'm going to focus on my own comparative advantage, which is basically this issue of how intellectual property rights seem to be affecting high-tech trade, direct investment, and so on. But I want to focus mostly on quite recent findings on these questions, because I think many of us may already know what this underlying baseline consensus is. I'm not going to go through that because time is short. All of that is interesting, but it's dated evidence there in terms of these 4 points right there. And let me just say that those 4 points are based upon quite aggregated or industry kinds of data sets that can give you interesting correlations, but are quite difficult to use to say much about causality. So as I mentioned earlier, the ability to use microdata is making a large difference here in terms of understanding how patenting and even intellectual property rights may be affecting firm level behavior and all of the outcomes from that. So let me start with this one, characteristics of high technology exports from developed countries to emerging economies. two recent papers, relatively recent papers, that I think are quite worth referring to. One by Olin Evis and one by Jenny Lin and Bill Lincoln. Basically, this is a set of results that I'm mashing together into this one slide here. But it's not perhaps surprising. It may surprise you to see that this finding that basically just a small share of U.S. manufacturing firms own U.S. patents. There are a great many small, medium-sized enterprises that don't. But those firms who do own patents account for 89% of manufacturing exports. So, it's pretty clear that concentration in technology, concentration in size, and in exports all are highly correlated. And then a second point here is that firms that actually do hold U.S. patents, which in the Lin-Lincoln paper are considered the treatment group in this context, they're considerably more likely to export their high technology varieties of final goods and inputs than are those without such patents to countries that engage in significant patent reforms. Now, that's a limited result because they're only looking at 6 episodes of significant patent changes. But it is suggestive. And then strengthened patent rights in developing countries tend to expand U.S. exports of new products, meaning the extensive margin is the one that really seems to be stimulated by patent reforms, at least as much, but probably more than the intensive margin of trade. And indeed, in the paper by Evis, she finds that these extensive margin effects account for virtually all the growth of U.S. exports to these reforming developing economies. So what does this suggest? Well, patent reforms increase access to new technologies and products, and then multinational firms in particular pay attention to patent laws in choosing their export locations. Now, I will have to say that is very informative information or knowledge, but we still have this question about what are the mechanisms? How do they interact with these patent rights in various countries? A few studies have been putting attention into that question. And then, of course, there are these variety gains, both on the output side and intermediate inputs that probably have spillover productivity effects. Now, that all sounds good, but what we don't yet have and we really need are studies of how IP reforms may affect the survival rates of local firms in reforming economies. This is always one of the big trade-offs going back very far in this literature. Well, you may get some spillovers, and that's beneficial for firms that survive and use them, but you may also see a fair amount of churn in the domestic economy associated with IP reforms, and we just don't know much about that latter part yet. Second interesting result here, cross-country patenting correlates with export volumes. An old question or assertion, let me put it that way, in this kind of literature is that, well, trade follows patenting, if you will, that somebody has an expectation that they want to export a product to a particular market, and so they go get a patent there. And we didn't have much evidence of how true that really was, but there's this excellent new working paper by Gaetan and others from a year ago, and basically what they found using microdata, French exporting firms at the product level, where in fact what they could do is link product level patents to product level production and destination of exports. And this ability to link product patents to product trade is a big advance, and I'll just thank in passing Travis Libert for putting together the means for doing that, and he may be talking about that himself. But here are some really interesting results. If a firm has recently acquired a patent in an export market, that raises the probability of exporting to that market by about 3 percentage points, which may not sound by much, but across all of these export markets, that's significant. Second, on average, firms have about 10% higher export values in the average product in the locations where they own patents compared to places where they export the products but don't have a patent. And you might think that that's a price effect, but in fact, they find that this increase in value is almost entirely because of rising export volumes, not because of increased prices, at least if you believe in unit values. So their interpretation, quite interesting, is that firms seek export market certainty through the acquisition of a patent, but they don't, or perhaps can't, exercise much monopoly power due to those local patents. And I think, to some degree, this is because of the highly micro orientation of this data. So there are a lot of substitute goods at that level, but nevertheless, I think that's very valuable research. And here's the third thing that I'm not sure how familiar people are maybe with, which is this: IP protection in developed countries does sometimes have the potential to slow down the growth of high technology exports from developing countries. And this is a policy issue. So there's this paper by Walter Park and others that shows that export growth to developed countries from emerging sort of middle income economies with higher technological capacity. So we're talking about emerging economies with relatively sophisticated capacity to produce, if not invent new goods. So that growth of exports diminishes as their firms move into more patent-oriented sectors, so sector by sector. And why is this? Well, it's because local IP protection in, say, Europe and the United States can block potentially infringing imports, and that then serves as a deterrent to technology-oriented export growth. And there is no such deterrent on the other side of this trade flow. So I'm not sure I believe all of this. There's a lot to be looked at in this context, and much more research needed. But it does raise this important question about the role that how North and South IP protection may interact with each other in determining flows of international trade. Fourth point I'd like to bring out here is that certain learning channels correlate with increased exports of emerging countries after IP reforms. There's a paper that I did with a couple of my colleagues a few years ago. And what we were trying to understand is what are the channels or mechanisms through which there are these productivity spillovers and learning spillovers in emerging economies that generate growth in trade. And so we looked at these three measures here: non-resident patent application stocks, a share of a country's intra-firm imports and U.S. total imports, increases in the share of U.S. affiliate employment and total employment. And when you interact those variables with patent reforms, they all seem to have large and positive economic effects on patent-intensive exports. So there is this suggestion at this point of this spillover effect that's pretty generalized. And I think we need a lot more research on that, but that's, I think, going to point some way towards more research. A fifth faith result that I don't want to spend much time on, but this does use micro trade data for Chinese firms, is this one. Can you find some evidence that local variations in intellectual property enforcement actually change the exporting and innovation profile of these Chinese firms? And basically what we do find is pretty strong evidence in the data that Chinese firms that are headquartered in provinces with relatively stronger, it's hard to measure this to be sure, IP enforcement at the judicial level, become more likely to export, become more likely to import capital goods, more likely to introduce new products, and there's a big export volume effect as well. So that's pretty suggestive of perhaps some local innovation aspects of this IP protection. Of course, a big caveat: measuring IMP enforcement at any level, certainly at the subnational level, is a hard thing to do. If we want to get back to that, we can. And then there's a brand new literature coming out now. Several people looking at this, including myself and a colleague of mine at the University of Illinois, Bill Ridley, which is asking this kind of question: do preferential trade agreements with elevated IP chapters affect high technology trade or other elements of competition? And this is a hard thing to study for lots of reasons, and we really do need, this literature needs to get into the micro data as well. It hasn't yet penetrated that except on the trade side. Here are a couple of examples of some results from research we're doing. But I just wanted to mention in passing, if you don't know this, the World Bank has put together this enormous data set characterizing all the preferential trade agreements in the world in terms of their sort of behind the border regulatory issues. That's not just IP, but it's competition and environment and so on. And that is a rich potential set of data for studying really important questions we haven't been able to get at so far, such as not just trade effects, but are there patent generation effects within these kinds of trade agreements? I'd say we're just at the beginning of that whole research agenda, but there do seem, at this stage at least, to be some indications that these kinds of IP-related preferential trade agreements can, in fact, increase exports to third countries in specific sectors, and those are biopharmaceuticals, medical devices, that kind of thing. So that's some suggestion of at least quite conditional innovation aspects of these preferential trade agreements. I'm just about going to finish here, but I do want to finish up after this slide with some comments about where this research can go. So in a fairly recent paper with some other colleagues, we asked this question that really needs a lot of research, which is to what extent does IP protection interact with the availability of domestic financial markets or the form of financial markets in encouraging R&D. So this is, again, another really old question in the literature. Do patents or the ability to generate patents somehow affect innovation? And to what extent does that correlate, or does it interrelate with the availability of domestic financing? And we've done this sort of extensive paper using analysis, using available measures of research and development by sector across a large number of countries. And basically what we get is that stronger legislated patent rights in the sort of Janotary Park sense increase R&D spending by more in patent-intensive sectors where financial markets are less developed regarding bank lending and stock market capitalization. We can talk more about that. But in essence, the interpretation of that is that patents do substitute for weak financial protection or weak financial incentives, let me put it that way. And that's in terms of the theory here, because firms that propose to engage in R&D projects become more willing to actually take these risks. Okay. Let me finish with some comments on where research can go in this context. And this, I'm just listing 5 of many important potential areas of research with respect to technology transfer and local productivity effects. And none of this is really about innovation, what Cosimo was talking about. There's an entirely different agenda there, but certainly important. So has there been a causal impact of this global spread of IP protection on the rate and direction of innovation and technology diffusion? I think we know more about the technology diffusion part than about innovation. But what we really don't know is to the extent that this growth and innovation in this period has been due to TRIPS or some other factors. And, you know, at a basic level, you can even ask whether TRIPS has been positive in this context because the rate of growth of innovation has probably slowed down in terms of the output measures, but that's, as Karsten said, because it just becomes so much more difficult to achieve new results. And we don't really know where TRIPS fits in this context. I hope my panelists will correct me on that if I'm wrong. What are the interrelationships between trade liberalization and IP policy reform and affecting trade and innovation? This is the great thing that interests me right now. We know very little about how tariff cuts affect the endogenous change in IP policy reforms and how that affects trade. How and why does copyright protection affect international knowledge flows in copyright intensive sectors? That's a big part of what the last presentation was about. So I'm glad to hear all of that. But what the real problem here is we just don't know how to measure elements of digital innovation and trade in assets as well as we need to. So to me, that's a big part of where public authorities need to be putting their resources. What roles do IPRs play in the development of production and innovation networks within multinational enterprises? Carson's work at the WIPO has been really spectacular on this understanding of where these innovation networks lie. But we'd like to know more, I think, about what the actual role IP is playing here. And then finally, what are the effects of IP protection on the potential for digital trade? What would be the mechanisms involved? Again, Cosimo mentioned that, but there's a long way to go before we really understand that. So that's a large agenda that's remaining. A lot of work to be done by economists, by legal scholars, many others, especially by the international organizations. So I'm looking forward to hearing from others. I think, Bob, I'll stop there. I don't know if I went over time or not, but is that all right?
Good place to stop, Keith. A little bit over time, but that's okay. You laid out some very good questions for us to explore here at the end. One thing so far, none of the presentations have touched upon, and you know, obviously we care about trade here, but there's also questions around tax policy and implications for intangibles and intangible flows. So I think those are some pretty important questions that we should be considering also. But let's move ahead. Our next speaker is Nathan Weissman, Chief Economist at EURIPO, and you're going to be talking about the link between IPR and firm performance in the European Union. And if you get a chance, please take a look at the questions coming in. Some of you have been getting very specific questions, so look in the Q&A flow there. Nathan, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Let me just share my presentation. So, okay, let's put it in slide mode. Right, I trust that you can all see it.
And we can, yes.
Okay, very good. So I have put together a presentation that basically has two main parts. The first part indeed looks at the link between IP rights and firm performance. And the second part at the end just has a few slides on let's say on a more macro level that illustrates the workings of the EU's internal market in terms of job creation by companies in other countries. All of the studies that I'm going to, this presentation is based on 3 studies essentially that we conducted in 2019 and 2021 in cooperation with the European Patent Office, and there are links to them at the end of my presentation. Oops. Okay, so in the first study we look at this is actually quite recent. In February, it was published in February of this year. Where we look at the relationship between IP rights and performance of individual companies. So this is basically a study that uses a large number of firm level data, observations for 127,000 firms in all EU member states. And there is a particular focus on small and medium-sized enterprises in this study, and also in the second one that I will describe briefly, because, well, for policy reasons, this is a very important topic, not only in Europe, but elsewhere as well. So if we look just some characteristics about the sample that we have. So if we look at overall ownership of IP rights, and when I say IP rights here, I refer to patents, trademarks, or designs, whether on national or European level. Then we see that only 8.8% of the companies in our sample owned any kind of IP rights, and of course this is dominated by the fact that that the vast majority of the companies in the sample are SMEs, and they own, and only 8.7% of them own one of the 3 IP rights in question. You can see on the right side of the slide, you can see the distribution of ownership. So large firms, of course, tend to be more internationally active than small firms, and so a much higher proportion of large firms own European trademarks or European designs or European patents compared with SMEs, which are much more nationally focused. Okay, some of the key findings here, and again, this study is a let's say a descriptive study in the sense that there is an econometric part and there is a purely descriptive part, and of course this is very much more about correlation than causation, I have to say, but nevertheless some good indications. So if we just do a straight comparisons of the 2 groups of companies between those that own one of the 3 IP rights and those that don't, then what we find is that on average, without controlling for anything, The companies that own IP rights have 20% higher revenue per employee and pay 19% higher wages than companies that don't own IP rights. And those numbers are especially high for companies that own patents, where you can see that they have 36% higher revenue per employee and pay 53% higher wages than companies that don't own any of the IP rights. Okay, we then, of course, wanted to, I mean, what I showed on the preceding slide was just a straight comparisons of the two groups of firms, which is easy, but it's not, of course, the interesting bit is to control for the different relevant characteristics. And we control mainly for the country in which the firm is based, the sector in which it operates, the size of the firm, because of course, even within, let's say, the SME categories, there are quite big variations in terms of size, and the age of the firm. And what we found, and again, all the details are in the paper, but what we found is that when you control for those characteristics, then overall this premium, as we call it, so revenue per employee difference between owners and non-owners, rises to 55% for all companies. Okay, and if we look specifically at small and medium-sized companies, then that difference becomes 68%. Okay, that's for owning just one of the three IP rights. If the red bars show the effect of bundling, so what we see, the strongest effect comes when a company owns both patents, trademarks, and designs, which intuitively makes sense because you patent something because you have some innovation that you protect with the patent, but it's really. But the fact that you take out a trademark or register a trademark implies that you're bringing that something to the market, and of course that's where you're going to generate revenue from that. Okay, we also looked at the impact of the kind of country in which the company is located. The EU publishes an innovation scoreboard where the member states are ranked according to, in 4 groups basically, according to how innovative they are. And what we see here, so we take, again, the same 55% premium in terms of revenue per employee for IP rights owners, but that premium now for companies that are located in modest and moderate innovating countries is actually higher, 70%, compared to only 40% for companies that are located in more innovative countries. So this seems to indicate, of course, that if you are an innovative company, as signaled by the fact that you have registered IP rights, then you have a relatively great or even competitive advantage, if you will, if your domestic market is a not particularly innovative one. You stand out more, so to speak. Okay, so that's the summary of the results that I just outlined. Now, this was, of course, a static analysis. I mean, it's a cross-section analysis of a large number of companies in the European countries. But of course, when we talk about innovation and when we talk about the importance of small and medium-sized enterprises to the European economy, then it's not all SMEs that are created equal. So a second study that we did, again, together with our friends from the European Patent Office, looked at the relationship between the registration of IP rights and subsequent growth of companies. Okay, because just some background information. The European Commission has an official definition of what is a high growth firm. We used a slightly more stringent definition. So for us, a high growth firm is a company that during a 3-year period has an average growth rate in turnover, in revenue of at least 20% per year. In the European Commission terminology, that would be 10%. So we found that in 2016, there are just under 180,000 such firms in the European Union. So it's really only a small minority of SMEs that generate the growth and the employment that we want to see. Sorry. Okay, so in the study, we look at, of course, we also look in particular at the international dimension of the behavior of the companies. And we look at companies in manufacturing industries. So this study focuses on 65,000 SMEs in manufacturing industries in Europe. And as I said, we basically looked at their activity in the IPR space, and then we looked at their economic performance during subsequent years to see if that we could identify a relationship between IPR activity and subsequent growth of the companies. Okay. First, some description of the sample. So this is the frequency of IPR used by the company, by these 65,000 companies. So about 18% of them owned one of the 3 IP rights in question. And you can see the distribution here. So as not unsurprisingly, trademarks is the one that most widely owned, 14%, followed by patents and designs. Okay, so what are the central results that we found in this study? Well, first, this is the central result. Effectively, what we found is that companies which engaged in registration of IP rights had a 10% higher likelihood of achieving high growth in subsequent years, or 21% higher odds or likelihood of achieving growth. Okay. So this we interpret as the effect of innovation. I mean, what's really underlies that growth, of course, is not the registration of the IP rights per se, but it's the registration of the IP rights that signals the presence of an innovation. But interestingly enough, we then also looked at we compared European level IP rights with national level IP rights, and there we found an even stronger relationship. So companies that registered the European trademark, for example, they had a 26% higher likelihood of achieving growth and 17% higher likelihood of achieving high growth in subsequent years. So here it's the innovation coupled with the cross-border activity of these companies that seem to be signaled. Looking at the effect of bundling, again, it's the combination of the different kinds of IP rights that really that is related to subsequent high growth of the company. So you can see companies that register all 3 types of IP rights have a 1/3 higher likelihood of subsequent high growth compared to non-registrants of IP rights. Percentages are lower for companies that just register single IP rights or bundles of any 2 IP rights. So, finally, shifting to an industry level perspective, we have published 3 industry level IP contribution studies, as we call them, where we look at those are purely descriptive studies that basically look at the contribution of industries, of sectors that have been identified as being intensive in the use of IP rights to the EU economy. Similar studies have been carried out for the United States by the USPTO, and in fact, it was an original 2012 study published by the USPTO that was the inspiration for this line of work on our part. I'm only going to show you a very small selection of charts information that we have in that study. First of all, so in this chart, we look at where does the innovation occur? So where do the patents? I focus here on patents, but in the report we have the same statistics for trademarks and designs as well. So in which EU member states register the most patents at the EPO? Okay. Well, of course, Germany will be in first place, unsurprisingly, followed by France, the UK, which was still a member state at the time the study was done, but also Netherlands is quite high, especially considering its size. So because of the differences in size, the blobs here are kind of a pseudo map of Europe that show that related to the size of the country as measured by a number of employees in the IP rights intensive industries. And there you can see that actually, setting Luxembourg aside for the moment, if you look at the other countries, then you see that actually the Dutch are doing quite well on this score with 0.86 patents per 1,000 employees, followed by some of the other northern countries, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. Germany, while still impressive, it's still, it's not nearly as impressive when looked in relative terms. And of course, when we look at the companies in what we still sometimes call new member states, even though they're not that new anymore, then it's very, very few patents that come out of countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Lithuania, etc. Okay, but then we look at the jobs. And this is, of course, where the single market works, because the idea of the single market, to put very bluntly, is that if a French car company wants, it innovates, it creates designs, etc., but it wants to manufacture the cars in a location that may be a bit more cost effective than France. And because we now have a single market, it can do that in a country like Romania, for example. And so if we look at the jobs created, so what you see on this chart is the jobs in each EU member state in IP right intensive industries that are created by companies coming in from the outside. So if we look at Romania, for example, then we see that 40% of jobs in Romania in those sectors are created by companies from outside Romania. And the dark part of each bar shows jobs created by companies from other EU member states. Okay, so in Romania, that would be about 30%, 31% perhaps. And you can see the countries at the top are Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, the Czech Republic. So those are the companies that joined the European Union in 2003 and 2007. So again, they're not so new anymore. But let's say the Central and Eastern European countries are high at the top there. And you can also see that for all countries except the UK and Ireland, it is companies from other EU member states that tend to create the highest proportion of jobs coming in from outside. Okay, if we look at specifically at patents, we have a similar picture. We now have Malta pretty high on the list here, but of course that's probably the fact that there are not very many big Maltese patent-intensive companies. So, but again, we have countries like Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, the Czech Republic at the top. So same pattern as before. Finally, looking at it the other way around, we look at from where do these jobs that are created in EU member states, the cross-border jobs, if we want to call them that, from where do they originate? So we see here that unsurprisingly, it is German companies that tend to create jobs in other EU member states. So of the 5.3 million cross-border jobs in our study, 1.7 million of them were created by German companies, followed by 1.2 million by French companies, etc. So these are jobs created by companies from those countries in other EU member states. And well, it's a fairly high number and high numbers. And if, of course, if some people will begrudge this in a way, talking about delocalization and things like that, but but from an overall perspective, it is what an internal market does. It is how an internal market is supposed to function, and it is functioning in this case. Okay, so as I said, there are references, and the presentation will be distributed after the event, so you don't have to note down these horribly long links. I apologize for that, but I don't control our IT department. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nathan. So that was quite excellent. We've now had two presentations that have looked at data and really cut it in many different dimensions. One's global, and the other one European-centric, but both with, I think, some pretty interesting insights. And then we've had two presentations with literature updates and literature reviews. So so far, a lot of intellectual fodder for us to work our way through. Now I'd like to ask Andrew Toll, Chief Economist at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, to talk about his presentation using intellectual property data to measure cross-border knowledge flows. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Let me share my screen here. I hope you'll be able to see it.
We can see it, yes. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So my presentation is going to be slightly different, which I think is probably good. It's good to see the variety. I've been very impressed actually so far with what everyone has said. And I certainly am enthusiastic about the calls for additional research that have already been put on the table. So what's different about what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes, and I'm probably going to move somewhat faster, I assume, through my slides. I don't have quite as much material. But what I would like to do is summarize the chapter that we have contributed to the Trade in Knowledge book that will be forthcoming um, out of the Cambridge University Press. And in that chapter, what we really want to do is take a step back and look at the literature. And we asked ourselves, what are the different types of intellectual property rights data that are actually being used by the researchers to explore the hypotheses and to provide evidence for trade in knowledge. And I think the first challenge there is of course, well, let me just highlight the key aspects of what we do in our chapter, but then get to one of the key challenges that we faced right in the beginning. But in this chapter, we look at the academic work. So it's a survey of the literature. We identify the data that are used in the different studies. We ask ourselves and we catalog, how did they use the data? What kind of concept were they trying to measure with the information? And then we also identify some other information, other data sources that aren't as utilized in the literature that may be helpful going forward. So that's what we do in our chapter. But the first real challenge here, I think, is just to define what is trade in knowledge, right? So it's pretty much agreed upon that when we talk about trade, we're talking about exchange. Cross-border trade is usually between countries. And so we focus on studies that look at trade between countries. But I think one of the challenging things here is to really define, what do we mean by knowledge? And knowledge can be quite general in many ways. And it's maybe not the case that we want to count whether somebody learned that it is raining in Michigan in the United States as that learning and that information as knowledge particularly. Now, it could be depending on the context. And so there's a little bit of a nuance there, right? So information can be knowledge if the right context exists. So this is a bit of a slippery slope. And actually, if you think about the literature a little bit, this is one of the concepts that is squishy, that is elastic and changes. And so it's important to be careful about that. And what we tried to do was really focus on what we thought is economic knowledge. So not just knowledge about the weather that's just nice to know and has no particular utility to you. Perhaps you're not going out in the rain and it says it's going to rain, so it doesn't really matter to you. But we wanted to really focus on the facts and the information and the skills that actually correlate and contribute to economic knowledge. And what is that? Well, we define that in the way that we look at the literature as it improves our understanding and it creates value that are reflected, of course, in the markets and in the economic indicators that we care about. So that makes, I think, a lot of intuitive sense. But just to reiterate very quickly, knowledge is a much broader concept than economic knowledge or economically productive knowledge. So as we reviewed the literature and we went across the literature over a wide scope of time, so we had a long time period that we considered. We also considered a lot of contributions, not just those in academic journal articles, but primarily peer-reviewed journals. And really, it comes down pretty simply to a few types of data sources that are used here across the whole literature, and that is primarily patent documents. And we've heard already today that patent documents in a couple of the studies, and that's nothing wrong with that. I think actually intellectual property data do provide an excellent opportunity to try to get at these issues. But what we're going to do and what I'm going to show you in just a couple minutes here are a few slides that try to play a little bit of a devil's advocate to say, well, we know intellectual property data, patent documents are very important, and we know that royalty flows and financial flows through royalties and licensing fees are actually very important. But what don't we know about them, and why might we overinterpret perhaps some of the evidence and the information that gets presented? So with respect to patent counts, we've seen this already, and we do it in our own work, of course, because it's valuable, but people count applications, they count granted patents. So these are counting citations. They look at classifications across technologies, and then of course, group patents into patent families, which actually patent families themselves are important to keep in mind that there are many varieties of patent families, and it really depends on kind of the context about how you define patent families, and that's also an issue. But location differences are obviously important. So differences in where applicants are located, who are the owners of the intellectual property, of the patent, for instance, and the inventors. And we've seen that already today. And it's very interesting and I think informative. So as we looked across the literature, what are the set of concepts that these academic researchers primarily, but also some folks in the policy environment, what are the set of concepts that they really try to measure with intellectual property data? Well, the first thing they try to measure are knowledge flows, right? Information that flows, economically valuable information that flows from country A to country B. And of course, we've heard a little bit about that. Second, most important, I would say, concept that that the researchers are trying to get at with intellectual property data is technology transfer. So they want to actually know, is an invention actually moving from country A to country B and adopted by country B and used there, even though it was developed in country A. So that's a very important concept, and I'm just going to mention a couple things about it. In our chapter, we talk about these in much greater depth than I'm going to cover here. IP data are also used to measure the strength. So different country, the Genote Park Index for the strength of intellectual property in a country. So that's obviously a very important indicator. It's used to characterize the intensity of an industry. So how technology intensive is an industry? How do we figure that out? Well, we'll look at the number of patents relative to the number of employees in that industry, and we'll make a judgment. Maybe it's above the mean. That means it's technology intensive or patent intensive. So that it's used in that regard. It's been very important, actually, as patent documents particularly, have been very important for technology proximity metrics. So how close are two companies in terms of technology space? And we expect a lot of good things to happen in terms of spillovers when companies are closer, because they can understand the knowledge being produced by one company can be understood by the other when they are closer in technology space. This goes back to an idea that was developed called absorptive capacity, the ability to understand what others are saying externally. You need to have some internal capacity called absorptive capacity. And so technological proximity is often very important and used. Inventor mobility is another concept that's used. It's also looking at the different addresses of inventors. But how do you know that Andrew Toole in the United States is the same as somebody and Andrew Toole in the UK? You don't know necessarily. So there's an issue about is that person the same person or not? And I'm going to get to that in a minute. And then finally, the patents are often used as an indicator of innovation. It's a proxy. Technically speaking, of course, patents are legal rights on inventions. They're not innovations per se, but there is a correlation there, particularly in the pharmaceutical and other kinds of industries with discrete products. So when we mapped the different concepts to the data, it really points all the way back again to patent documents. So once again, not surprising to anybody on this call, patent documents are critical. So we need to understand what are the limitations of patent documents as a form of data. And I think part of that limitation, I will highlight in just a second, but certainly on its face, one of the most important limitations from an economics perspective is this is a legal document. It's not an economic document, it's a legal document, and it has legal rights associated with it. And so we need to actually think about what the implications are of that for our economic analyses. I just want to spend a couple of minutes here going over some of the, just really briefly going over some of the literature that uses these different forms of IPR data. And I'm just going to jump quite quickly actually to the caveats, because I think one of the main things we wanted to accomplish here was to figure out what do we need to keep in mind when we read these documents and we read these papers with these data. What do we need to keep in mind to make sure we don't overinterpret what we're seeing? And so when it comes to patent count indicators, it's very, very uncertain as to why the company or the individual is actually taking out a patent in any particular jurisdiction. In other words, what is the motivation behind the actual patenting choice? It could be a number of reasons that aren't necessarily economic. Strategic reasons are often considered, and they may be economic in terms of trying to block competitors, but the motivations are largely unknown in all of this literature. And it's important to try to get to those at some point as we move forward in this area. And firms patent in foreign jurisdictions for lots of reasons, again, to block competitors. And information in patents, we know, is disclosed 18 months after the priority date. So while there may be a patent, and patent rights are territorial. So if I see a patent that's been published in the United States and I'm sitting in Europe and there's no filed application in Europe, or I'm sitting on the African continent, I can take that information and I can use it in my jurisdictional territorial area. And so that information can flow without actual patents being filed by the same entity. Patent citation measures are used to capture knowledge flows in most cases. And they're limited in the sense that for the United States particularly, we have this information on granted patents. We don't have citations on patent applications or at the publication stage. And so that really limits the use of citations. However, citations have been correlated with economic value. So that is one of the reasons economists keep relying on this. Many of my lawyer colleagues are less enthusiastic about citations as indicating much about knowledge flow. The reason is because a lot of the citations are actually added by legal representation and not by the inventors themselves. The logic, of course, of citations is that if I cite your work and I'm an inventor, that means I read your work and I incorporated it into my innovative process and thinking. But that's not necessarily the case due to examiner added citations in the United States and legal representation added citations. When it comes to IP royalty and licensing fees, this is very interesting information. But the trade in products and services that involve IP, it may not be that this information, this financial flow represents a knowledge flow. So for instance, if I pay a license, if I pay a royalty fee to show a movie that was developed in the United States, that will show up in the data. But is that it's unclear whether that actually represents a transfer of knowledge. Now, if it's shown in theaters and they make money, then it entered the market, and perhaps it can be interpreted that way. But again, I think much of the data require a greater context for really understanding it. Let me just end quickly now with three comments on areas where I think data could be improved. First of all is this assignee and inventor disambiguation, sometimes called name harmonization. And many studies do not use this. So for instance, going back to this Andy Toole inventor example, if this person's in the US and in the UK, do we say that it's the same person that maybe went from the US to the UK and then patented in the UK, or is it the same person? And this is particularly difficult with common names. And so we are actually undertaking at the Office of Chief Economist at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office very substantial efforts here to do two layers of what we call disambiguation. Number one is to clean those names. There's many hundreds of typos and various spellings of names, which pollute the data in a way that makes us not able to connect the people that are in two places who are in fact the same person because their names were spelled one with an error and one not, so we couldn't connect them. But beyond that, we also have ownership structures. So there's not just tons of problems with the names, but the ownership structure as well. And so connecting all the subsidiaries of international business machines across the globe is actually a very difficult thing. There's a tremendous churn in ownership of different components of companies over time. Trademark data, I haven't seen as much in the literature. We didn't find it used as much, but it's also a great opportunity. It was discussed a little bit today, and I think it's more opportunity for work there. And then finally, I think there's also more opportunity for the patent and trademark assignment data. That's where there's actually a record of transfer of intellectual property from one party to another in most cases, and that that would be ideal if we could build out that kind of data on a better and on an international basis, actually, ideally. All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to talk today.
Thanks, Andrew. So how much knowledge do we have about knowledge data? It strikes me as very similar to many of the discussions I have with my boss here about what does this trade data mean? So it's often hard to say. Well, let's move on to our next presentation. Travis Libbert, professor in the Department of Agricultural Resource Economics, UC Davis, is going to talk about how do patents shape global value chains, international and domestic patenting and value-added trade. All right, Travis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here and to be at least virtually gathered with so many luminaries and scholars and influential policymakers. It's great to be a part of this. So this work that I'll touch on, I'll briefly summarize, is in collaboration with Nicholas Zolas at the U.S. Census Bureau, and I'll jump right in here and talk about sort of the work that we've done over the last few years trying to understand global value chains and the way patents in particular influence the structure of global value chains. And I'll just start out as we celebrate this the 25th year of the TRIPS agreement. It is interesting to me that there is sort of a testable hypothesis embedded in the agreement, the title of the agreement, which is like how do we understand the relationship between trade and IPRs? What exactly is the related part in the TRIPS agreement? And that question actually is interesting for a lot of the reasons that the other panelists have already brought up and put on the table, which is that there's just a lot of heterogeneity across countries, across industries, across firms. And so from my perspective, most of my work actually is as a applied microeconomist in development. And so I think a lot about low and middle income countries, and so thinking about how those strategies are shifting over time, how they reflect comparative advantage between different countries, is a big part of what draws me to these questions. And it's interesting, I think, one other interesting kind of big picture reflection on TRIPS at 25 is that over the last 25 years, we've seen this sort of hastening of what Richard Baldwin calls the great unbundling that started maybe in the 80s. But so that what's interesting to me here is the TRIPS agreement signed 25 years ago was sort of reflecting an understanding of trade and trade relationships that prevailed at the time, and they have since those trade relationships have since evolved in a variety of ways, and in particular they've sort of become fragmented as value chains have become more globalized. So here what we will be doing is offering kind of an industry level analysis that's meant to be complementary to the kind of firm level studies that we've heard a little bit about. And so that what we're gonna do specifically is to try to understand how international and domestic patent flows affect these global value chains at the country industry level. So once we map the two, this is every time there's a new iPhone that comes out, there's some new kind of graphic or visualization of the global value chain behind the iPhone. This is one for iPhone 6. And the point is just that in this great unbundling, that the value chains have become more complex, more fragmented in many ways, and there are real implications in both directions. Sort of the patents can influence where those value chains develop, and where they develop can influence subsequent innovation activity. I'll just quickly mention sort of the work on. There's a whole field in trade, international trade, that uses these more detailed input-output databases to try to create metrics that reflect the structure of global value chains. beyond imports and exports, but really thinking of sort of value added in the value chain, how much value added is localized in certain jurisdictions. And you see this sort of sweep of perspective from the conceptualization of TRIPS and through the 2000s, and so, you know, big question, of course, is what does that look like after the dust settles from the pandemic? But you see these interesting patterns in these global value chain measures that include there's a whole bunch of them, but they basically are just different ways of understanding how much value added is being generated in different locations relative to the overall sort of net value added across the entire chain. I'll just mention this one. This is sort of a nice way to depict. This is this vertical axis here is capturing what's called the value added export ratio. So this is the share of value added relative to total exports from a location. And in this study, this is just picking up the impact of a regional trade agreement on production fragmentation. A pretty striking depiction using an event study approach to show the impact at the point of the trade agreement being signed, what that means then for subsequent fragmentation of production. Basically, the trade agreement facilitates these complex value chains, right? It enables this production fragmentation to occur, and that fragmentation is sort of essential to the development of these modern global value chains. So what we're going to do, what we do here, and I'll just hit on a couple of highlights, is really building on this work that Nick and I did a few years ago that came out in Research Policy, which is proposing a way to think algorithmically about linking the classification schemes that structure patents and the classification schemes that structure trade and industrial data. Incidentally, since we've touched on it here and there, to this point, trademarks, we've done the same thing for trademarks, and I completely agree with the other speakers who emphasize the need for a little bit more serious work on trademarks, because certainly when you look in low and middle income countries, you get a lot more action and reliance on trademarks than you do on patents. So having said that, the what I will talk about here in the next few minutes is really focused on patent data. So what that linkage allows us to do is it allows us to get the economic data and the patent data to kind of speak to each other at different levels of resolution. We can kind of pick the level of resolution based on the question, but because there's so much heterogeneity in the way patents are used and the way and the role they play, the relative importance in different industries or different locations, being able to kind of pick a level of resolution is important, and it also sort of allows us then to kind of speak to policy, right? So we can adjust the level of kind of resolution in the linkage to reflect the underlying motivating policy questions. So what we do here is use that linkage, that concordance to link PatStat data to ISIC data, trade level data, that allows us then to capture these GVC metrics. And those GVC metrics and the patent flows. So once we have them both sort of speaking to each other, those are gonna be annual, bilateral, or unilateral. They're directional, and they're also country industry specific, right? So we can again sort of think about these relationships kind of at the same resolution that often policymakers are forced to think about them. So this analysis in particular, what we're going to do is think about how do patent grants in particular, how do they affect the structure of these global value chains as captured by these metrics, these measures of global value chains. Now, of course, that's sort of that's what we do in this analysis, and the decision to apply for patent protection is sort of some period, some years sometimes prior to the patent grant that we see granted. That's what we do in this analysis. And I'll come back at the end to thinking about like, what does that mean? You know, what happens? What does it mean for what happens further down the timeline here? So what we end up with is this data set. So the concordance is what allows us to link the IPC data to the ISIC data. It's the ISIC data that gives us these GVC measures that I won't touch on in great detail. But so that once we have this merged data set, we can actually do quite a lot to try to get at this question of how do patent grants affect the shape of global value chains as captured by those measures. So just to give you a sense, this is one visualization of that mapping. This is in the case of this ISIC 1513, which is the processing and preservation of fruits and vegetables. This was for a separate kind of agri-food study that we did. But you can see, so the relative share of these breakdowns in IPCs is a reflection of the underlying kind of textual structure of patents and what you see in the patent document itself that then maps to these expanded terms related to this ISIC category. So that's kind of the link. That's kind of the intuition of the linkage. So let me just instead of walking through in great detail, I'm just going to summarize in bullet points what we find. So we do find a measurable effect of patents on global value chains. And in particular, here's the three that I'll just boil it down to. First, that international patent inflows and outflows into a jurisdiction, out of a jurisdiction, they increase value-added trade, but that effect is driven entirely by industries in high-income countries. Okay, so the effect of patent flows on value-added trade. Domestic patents increase value-added trade in the global value chains, but that effect is actually driven primarily by industries in middle-income countries. So you see this heterogeneity across high and middle-income countries. And then finally, that international patent flows shape the structure of GVC. So you can see in middle-income countries in particular, you can see that the kind of the architecture and these global value chain relationships are actually reflecting the receipt of, in particular, the receipt of patents from abroad. You don't see low-income countries represented here much at all. That's sort of one of my core interests, and that's where I think a lot more work could be done with trademarks. We see a lot more reliance on trademarks in low-income countries relative to high and middle-income countries. Limitations here to this study, you know, there's several. There's a few that I'll just flag. You know, we're always limited. There's the problem of kind of the street lamp, looking for your keys where the light is shining, and that's clearly an issue here with IPRs that we sort of are using global value chains measures. These are very much kind of a summary statistic. More than sort of a rich or complete kind of characterization of the underlying trade relationships. And Keith mentioned this earlier, that causal inference here is a challenge. And so we think we have sort of a loose argument for thinking about causality, but a lot more needs to be done, and could be done, I think, with the kind of data that is increasingly being made available. And then I already mentioned this on trademarks, that here we realize that we're sort of getting a very sort of thin view on the role of IPRs in global value chains. And I think a lot more could be done to try to think about the way that trademarks are actually affecting these kind of fragmented trade relationships. So just a couple, I'll just end in the next minute on policy questions. So I think it's interesting to reflect on this question. Like, what is it that we learn from thinking about trade relationships and trade-related intellectual property rights through a lens of global value chains? And I think that, you know, one way you can think about that is what are referred to as the two core global value chain concepts of upgrading and governance. And I think that those do offer sort of an interesting perspective on the relationship with intellectual property rights, patents and trademarks in particular. So how does one way we can think about sort of those two, upgrading and governance, is to think about what happens further down the timeline, right? How do changes in the global value chains affect subsequent innovation and patenting strategies? So this is what I just gave a really brief overview of this work that shows this link, really focused on how do patent grants affect the shape of global value chains. Obviously, where it becomes interesting is how innovation is sort of an endogenous reflection of the structure of global value chains, and how that then sort of could stimulate additional innovation in the future. So those I'll leave things there. I think there's a lot of interesting potential for global value chain perspectives, for adding patents and trademarks together to think about kind of the locational decisions that firms are making in these global value chains. Thanks.
Thanks, Travis. It was nice to see a paper getting close to the kind of work I've done on GVCs. And maybe at some point we could follow up on maybe some more granular data for you to look at there. The WIOD database isn't really going to help you get to any of the least developed countries, that's for sure. Okay, well, let me ask our panelists if they have any questions for one another. I saw Nathan, I think, weighing in with a comment. I do have some questions that have come in from the chat. Some have been answered, I think, or at least one has. But let me ask the panelists, given the presentations you've heard, do you have a question for a fellow panelist? And Nathan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question for Carsten, actually, on this, because, of course, his presentation was very, very interesting, very well done from a pedagogical point of view as well. My question is, this pattern of increasing international collaboration that you described, how do we see that going forward in light of the geopolitical situation as it's developing now? I mean, do you think, for example, that that the increasing strategic rivalry between China and the United States will have an impact on the level of collaboration that you depicted?
Bob, should I just go ahead?
Yes, let's make this as interactive as possible. So
Okay.
Please, yeah. And if you've got a question for somebody else, Carsten, please go ahead and ask that.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan, for your comment and the question. I think it's a really good question, and we've been asking that ourselves. And obviously, I don't have the answer, and I'm all data driven, and I think ultimately we will find the answer in the data. Unfortunately, the data that we use, so for that project, we published the report in 2019, and you always know that patent data are published with a delay. So the data we have, I think, runs until 2016 or 2017. And I think, some of the geopolitical tensions you referred, I think only happened after that. What I find interesting, though, is that, and that's why I think, this data-driven approach is really quite important, because, there is obviously always the geopolitical discourse that you read in the newspapers about. And sometimes, data do tell, quite a different story. I think, if you, for example, look at investment figures, I think there still has been quite a bit of investment in both directions between the United States and China, notwithstanding, I think some of the measures that of course have been put in place. So yeah, maybe maybe already worth having another look at the data, trying to answer that. If I could just make one comment, and this is just in a sense to underscore what Andy has outlined, and I think he made a few really important points, where I also feel that, once you start to work at an intellectual property office, and you're much more exposed to the practicalities of, patent and trademark filings and the strategies that companies adopt to file patents, I think that's something that's really important in terms of, you know, understanding how to interpret, especially at the international, you know, patent data, patent counts, and so on. And there are, of course, big differences. We know in the case of pharmaceuticals, for example, there's strong incentives to file your patent in many countries as possible, because if you don't have a patent, in many countries you have a generics industry that you know, would be able to produce a pharmaceutical compound and become a competitive threat. Whereas in many IT industries, especially in highly complex technology industries, you would only file a patent in, let's say, the 5 key jurisdictions, and not in many developing economies, because, you know, there is essentially no imitative threat, but you still do business in these economies. And just the fact that you don't see any patents there, I think, is not a reflection that, you know, the company is not interested in operating its technology, or the market isn't important. So there are lots of things that at least I've learned over the last 10 years where I think one has to be just extremely careful about how to use patent data in economic research. And I would just like to underscore, I think, all the sensible points that Andy made to that effect. Thank you.
Can I just react quickly? Sorry.
Please, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just this very last point that Carsten made actually is very interesting, because it's also very much in sync with what some of the several of the presenters have mentioned, the importance of also looking at trademarks and not just patents. And I think that's very true. Obviously, I work at an office whose main bread and butter business is trademark registration. I mean, we also do designs, but and indeed, I mean, trademarks have 2 advantages in my view. One is that of course the cycle is much quicker, right? I mean, here at EU IPO, it takes something 5-6 months from application to registration of the trademark if it doesn't get hit with an opposition. So the data is much fresher, so to speak. You don't have to worry about the lags as you do with patents. And secondly, and more importantly, it is really indeed this last point. You know, a company may not need to patent a certain technology in a certain market because there is little danger that somebody will copy it there. But if it intends to do business in that market, then it's definitely going to want to trademark its products or services in that market. So in that sense, the trademark activity is actually a very, very good indication of companies' behavior on the international scene. Thanks.
Thanks, Ethan. That's an excellent point. Could I ask Keith or Cosimo, given the research focus of your papers, given what you've heard, and Keith, maybe you're already familiar with all of these data challenges, but how does that, does it influence where you think the research agenda lies, given some of these data-related challenges?
Oh, it might, certainly. I mean, I've often wondered about the utility of trademark data in trying to understand flows of knowledge, or where firms choose to export or to invest. I think that's an exceptionally hard challenge, just because the nature of trademarks is legally distinct from patents. So what is a trademark? It's kind of a guarantee of the origin of a product. And trying to correlate that with actual decisions about how to transfer technology, I think has really escaped the literature so far. I mean, I remember Carson wrote a paper with using trademark data some years ago at the bank, if I'm not mistaken, Carson. It was difficult to make a real strong connection. So, I mean, I don't dispute the interest that could rise from using trademark data, but I'd like to, get back to this question of measuring knowledge. I mean, this is what Andy's paper is all about. It's all indirect, right? You have a patent that signifies something. You have a trademark that signifies something else. And you can't really compel firms to reveal what the knowledge is that they're trading. Maybe they couldn't even do it if you asked them. So I'm wondering if anybody on the panel has thought more about maybe using the data services of the major economies to think more carefully about what we really mean by this knowledge that's being traded. It could be perhaps consonant with the U.S. the Commerce Department of the United States is doing great work trying to dramatically increase the granularity of services trade data. And I think contemplating pretty carefully what IP services really are, but I'm not sure that even that's going to get there. So I'd be curious to hear from the panelists if they've thought much of it, especially from the IP offices, because this has got to be an issue of great concern to you guys. So let me just put it out that way.
Anybody want to take a shot at responding to Keith's question?
I don't think I can give a very good response because it's a tough question. The problem is that as Keith described, right? And I'm not sure who should be trying to figure out what kind of knowledge is embedded in a patent document versus a trademark versus a copyright, and if that knowledge is beneficial to the recipient or is just or is not supposed to be counted because it doesn't have any economic benefit. This is so difficult conceptually to do, even to think about conceptually, and then to actually layer on measurement on top of that is even more difficult. So I don't have a good answer. I pass it to the others if they can fill in for that very tough question. Good question, excellent question, but tough.
Cosimo, do you have any reactions? No? Okay.
No, not at this stage.
Well, let me take a question. Well, let me actually ask Tony. Tony, as the organizer of these seminars, webinars, this is a very interesting discussion given your long-term expertise in this area. Do you have any reaction to what Keith has put out there as a very tough question?
I was hoping to get the answers from this webinar. Not to evade the question, but no, I've got no specific. Yeah.
Well, let me raise something, Tony. Something you and I have been facing in discussions around vaccines, right? It isn't just patents; it's also know-how and capabilities. And this has been a big part of the debate around spreading vaccine production. Is how do you ensure that if you're going to share your recipe, that somebody's actually going to be able to know how to actually produce it, which goes well beyond what the recipe or the ingredients in the recipe tell you to do. So that seems to be a real big challenge on a very burning issue. And I think it gets at knowledge being much more than what's embedded in either a patent or a trademark. Maybe getting more to things like trade secrets, right? Anybody else on the panel got a question for another panelist, or should I go and take questions from the Q&A feed? Not seeing any quick reactions there. Okay.
Bob, if I could,
Keith.
Just briefly, you mentioned in one of your sessions this question of tax, let's just say avoidance, perhaps, in the intellectual property system. It is a really fascinating, interesting question. I think you need serious tax economists and scholars on a panel like this to get anywhere with that. But I'm curious what you're thinking. To me, it isn't so much the IP system that's driving that; it's the variations in the tax system that are driving that. And IP just becomes a convenient channel for doing that tax evasion. So do you see that there's a solution in the intellectual property system to this problem, or is it strictly within the taxation system?
I think it goes to a data issue, Keith, and that it could be that the tax policy environment could be distorting how IP is distributed. So if you look at some of, and particularly in data flows around royalties and payments for IP, how those are distorted in some of our balance of payments data, which then may make it difficult to actually do economic analysis of the returns to IP in certain locations. So that's how I was thinking. I didn't see the solution in the IP area, but I saw the tax discussion as, or the tax environment as distorting some of our core data, where we might look at some of that, search for some of the economic effects of IP. I see Nathan has his hand up. Nathan.
Yeah, I just want to comment on the point that Keith raised, because I thought was a very good point. I mean, clearly, as was obvious from the slide I had, which showed the patents per 1,000 people in the various European countries. I mean, obviously, some of those numbers are influenced by tax considerations. There is no doubt about it. But I think that Keith made a very important point, that it's not so much the IP per se that is leading to that, but indeed differences in the tax systems among countries, in the base and so on, and IP is just being used as one of the channels to basically, well, let's call a spade, to move money to low tax destinations so as to pay less tax if you're a multinational company. And IP is by no means the only vehicle for such things. I mean, one of my earlier lives, I work in the international reinsurance industry. And I can certainly assure you that some of the activity that goes on there is also very much motivated by tax considerations. Thanks.
Thanks, Nathan. Excellent point. I noticed the Netherlands showing up in your data. Karsten, your hand is up.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to turn what you, Bob, and Nathan have said a bit, turn that a bit around. I mean, when I read about, the seeming progress at the OECD towards, a multilateral framework of corporate taxation, possibly with a minimum corporate tax rate, I thought, hey, great, this could finally, in a sense, lead to more meaningful data on international royalty transactions, because essentially there are not that many incentives anymore to use that to essentially transfer profits from one location to another location. But what you possibly could then measure with these international royalty payments is closer to underlying technology flows, or in the case of the creative industries, the content that underlies movies and music and so on. So I wonder, whether, and we of course don't know yet, what this new momentum in these negotiations will lead to. But I wonder if maybe some of my panelists would share my naive optimism there, or would be more pessimistic. Just to tell you, maybe the reverse. We used to have really great data on inventor migration, and that had to do with some oddity in US patent law, that inventors also had to be listed as applicants, and because under MIPO's Patent Cooperation Treaty, you had to always declare both the residency as well as the nationality of inventors. So we had this great database on inventor migration because we had both the residency as well as the nationality of inventors. And whenever the two didn't match, we could assume a migratory background. Now, with the coming into force of the America Invents Act in 2011, I think, that went away, because there was not anymore this obligation to enlist inventors as applicants, and obviously that was not intended as such. But essentially, all the great data that we had, from 1 year to the next disappear. So my hope is that the reverse might happen here, because you don't have these incentives anymore to move corporate taxes. Maybe the side effect of that is going to be that suddenly we have much better data on international royalty flows. So just curious what my co-panelists think about that.
Anybody want to take on Karsten's comment, question? Not at this point, Karsten, I guess. Let me move to some of the questions that have come in through the feed, if that's okay. So this is a question for Karsten. According to your data, where do most patent applications stem from? Is it mainly from researchers at universities and public research institutions, or researchers in the private sector? This is from Paul Schnees.
Yeah, I think to that one, we would have very precise questions. I think generally I can tell you under the Patent Cooperation Treaty system, around 80% of patents are filed by companies, and you have maybe another 15% that come from universities and public research institutes, and a small percentage comes from individuals. There's a bit of variation across countries. Generally, especially in developing economies, there's a higher share of patents that originate in universities and public research organizations compared to private companies. And even between high-income countries, there are some interesting differences. In Japan, for example, the share of patenting by research institutes is much lower compared to other developed countries. But I think if the gentleman is interested, he should feel free to welcome me, and we have more data than you want to have on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Karsten. Okay, next question is from Moga Kamalyani for Cosimo. Entire patent portfolio in wartime, is it not similar to where we are now in terms of a global war on a global threat and the need for an entire portfolio waiver? I think this is relating to the TRIPS waiver discussion. Don't forget to unmute, Cosimo.
Yeah, I wouldn't compare the two situations. I know there are ongoing discussions about big waivers, but that was an entire expropriation of a country's portfolio, while the current situation is a health crisis, so it's much more self-contained type of patents that would be subject to the measures.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it was a difficult question, Cosimo. I think there's a similar question coming that may go to Tony, so be ready, Tony. Here's a question from Samuel Andrews for Keith. How are current IP treaties, especially the internet treaties, including the recent Beijing Treaty on Audiovisual Performance, addressing the income inequality gaps in the creative industries, examples, film and music? Keith, have you got any insights on that?
Not many. I think there are probably better people on the panel for this than I am. But so the Audiovisual Treaty is a landmark in my mind because it does offer exceptions, benefits for those from a particular disadvantaged class, independent of location, geography, and we may see that sort of thing going forward. Whether that actually is an effective means of addressing inequality, I don't think anybody's actually studied that question that I'm aware of. It could be a contributor, certainly to the extent that those who are visually impaired have a hard time accessing literature and information. And so that's great, but I suspect it's probably not a large contributor in that context, if I understand the question correctly.
Okay, thanks. So here's a question for Andy. Would you be able to comment about the use of copyright protection, DIF office, instead of patents since the Alice Supreme Court decision by innovators in the software tech industry? Sorry, I don't really understand many elements of that question. I hope I got it reasonably well.
Sure, I can try. So in June of 2014, the US Supreme Court had a ruling on Alice Corp versus CLS Bank International, and that ruling was about patent eligible subject matter. And it essentially made it much more difficult for applicants to patent abstract ideas in the United States. So no longer was a computer implemented algorithm sufficient. There had to be significantly more, and that was actually the phrase used in the decision. And what happened since then, I can tell you a little bit about what happened since then with respect to patent examination at the US Patent and Trademark Office. I cannot tell you much about how it relates to different kinds of IP, or I think you mentioned copyrights, which I don't know why this case would particularly influence copyrights, because it's a patent eligibility case. But in any case, we did a study on this. It's called Adjusting to Alice. And the reason we say adjusting to Alice is because what happens at a patent office in a jurisdiction such as the United States is that when legal changes come, they come like waves. And we know we're the patent office. We get hit by the waves and we have to readjust and rewrite ourselves when we get changes in law. And that's what happened with the Alice case with this new subject matter eligibility ruling that built on the prior Mayo case. And what we did a study on this. It's available on our website. We looked at technologies that were impacted by the Alice decision relative to ones that were not, before the decision and after the decision, sometimes referred to as difference in difference, with a treatment and control group kind of setup, which is a study design. Anyway, when we looked at that, we both saw visually in terms of nice pictures, but also econometrically in terms of magnitudes and statistical significance, that two things on two outcomes. Number one, there's a much higher probability of getting a first action rejection following the Alice decision on the Alice impacted technologies. So yes, it made it harder to kind of get a patent granted, and that's important. Because a lot of AI technologies, right, are considered to be falling into this category. So there's a lot of discussion that this may be influencing AI technology. So that's discussion that hasn't been proven. But the other thing, and the last point I'll make very quickly, is that we found that after the decision, there was a dramatic rise in the uncertainty. That is, the variation in decision making across the examiners became wider, suggesting that when an applicant puts an application into the office, he or that entity is less certain about how the examiner is going to rule. So there was an increase in uncertainty with respect to rejections after the Alice decision, and that increased uncertainty in patent rights could translate into increased uncertainty in economic decisions, such as R&D, maybe according to real options theory, right? Higher uncertainty. Decision makers become more hesitant to make decisions. They wait, the value of waiting increases. So there could be impacts downstream that we weren't able to connect, but that would be interesting. So I hope that sort of answers the question. I don't know if I completely hit it or not, but. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Let me ask Travis a question here. Travis, given what you heard about the tax discussion and your efforts to tie global value chains to intellectual property flows, does that give you any concern that that kind of tax distortions may be embedded in some of that WIOD GVC data and influence your analysis?
Interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, it almost certainly does, right? Because the data we have is the data that reflects prevailing tax codes and tax evasion strategies and the whole bit, right? I mean, so in some sense, what you see in any data that would try to capture the structure of global value chains would be sort of net of all the different forces and motivations that are pushing global value chains in a certain direction, right? So to the extent that tax policy is pushing production in different places, it's maybe prompting patent protection, patents to be filed in different jurisdictions. So certainly it would reflect all those things. And what we can't tell, obviously, is we can't sort of parse out what exactly that influence looks like, just that it's almost certainly there, right? And in fact, I would just say, this is to kind of broaden out and connect back to something both Andy and Carsten said that I think is really important, right? This really gets to kind of our limited understanding of the motivations behind patent applicants and firms in terms of where they file for protection and what they're looking to get out of it. And so we can't see, as Andy pointed out rightly, we don't see those motivations. We know that they run the gamut, and there's a lot of different motivations. What we see when we do any kind of empirical analysis, obviously, is sort of some data weighted average of all the different motivations that could potentially push an applicant to seek protection in one jurisdiction versus another. I will say that that includes even among the different motivations could obviously be tax evasion and responding to these differential tax rates. I will just to make one last kind of broader point. I do think that and I felt for some time, I do think that what I call the locational patenting decision is actually kind of underappreciated in a lot of research, like thinking about trying to about where an inventor or a firm seeks patent protection and how that reflects their strategy within a global value chain kind of framework, or sort of joint in kind of direct investment or joint ventures. I mean, I think the locational, and I guess I put that on the table only because I think the lower you go in kind of the income spectrum across countries, the more relevant the application decision becomes relative to generating new patents, right? So we were recently doing a study where we looked at the concentration. If you look at the concentration of patenting using a Herfindahl index, so that index is about twice as high for generating patents as it is for receiving patents, right? So which is what you would expect. So a lot of low and middle income countries actually do have sort of access to technologies through the receipt of applications. But yeah, you're right. The motivations that drive the flow of patent applications across borders is something we don't know a whole lot about because there's not a lot of data on it. So what we get is sort of this data weighted average of a whole bunch of different motivations.
Thanks, Travis. Tony, I see your hand is up.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I just very interested in the conversation about the impact of differential tax rates and tax planning. And I mean, I think one of the broader objectives we need to work towards is, in any event, a more precise and inclusive set of metrics about the flow of knowledge and about the flow of revenues from that knowledge. I mean, one of the challenges we have is that so much is locked up in the big digital platforms, the billions of individual IP transactions, which is what I call a download. This is really not entering our statistics at all. But I wanted to mention, and from that point of view, I think this is really important for trade policy, to the extent that shall we say, mercantilist instincts are really always going to be there. And even in front of a body of trade economists, I don't need to talk about the misleading nature of an obsession with trade deficits. But nonetheless, if the numbers are significant, we know that really major chunks of financial flows connected with access to IP are not being counted in the statistics. But in the forthcoming trade in knowledge volume that we've mentioned, in fact, Tom Neubig and Carsten's colleague, Sasha Vincent, have a chapter which sort of discusses the issue, but sort of turns the other way around, points out how tax planning distorts our measurement of knowledge flows and of related revenues. In other words, if we want to get a better sense of how economies, or how the knowledge economy is working through the international trading system, tax planning, because of those tax issues, is introducing major distortions, and they go through this in some detail, suggesting that overall there's the potential distortion exceeds 35%, which potentially throws all of our numbers out very dramatically. And in their chapter, they come up with a range of proposals ranging from tax administration to quite technical statistical measures. But it's just an interesting way of taking that issue, which is, I guess, predominantly a tax issue, but it's also distorting the way we even measure flows of knowledge and trade in knowledge as such.
Thanks, Tony. By the way, Tony, I just got a message. I may be called to the big boss office here in just a few minutes, something I can't avoid. So if I do, hopefully you can take over the moderation. I'll let you know. I'm supposed to get a call here soon. So there's an interesting question from Sheila Page asking, are there studies of individual industries, even of firms, that could yield at least anecdotal evidence on motivations for patents and patent location? Or could such studies be done, especially as it seems that the incidence of patents is so concentrated? In other words, it may not be able to be done because of the concentration. And I was struck by the data on the concentration of IP, which mirrors very much the concentration of large firms in trade data, not accounting for IP. So maybe that's what's driving the large firms trade, or maybe the way we tend to put it is that they can overcome the trade costs more than the small and medium-sized enterprises. But anyway, question is, any chance of individual industries or even firms that might provide some anecdotal evidence on motivations for patents and patent location? This is from Sheila Page. Keith, please.
I'm sure we could get answers from everybody here, but I'll just throw out a few observations. One is in the trade literature, we tend to start from a model-based estimation of these decision functions, and nothing would surprise you too much in that other than the sheer complexity of the models. But what it really comes down to is market size, market growth, the probability or the likelihood of local imitation if you don't get a patent. And then more recently, like I said earlier in my presentation, the old story was that you would get a patent because you expect to service a market. So it's a signal that you're going to do that. And that does seem to be true. Having said all that, at a more anecdotal level, especially in particular sectors, information technology, semiconductors, those kinds of microelectronics, and to some degree in pharmaceuticals as well, a big part of your patenting decision globally is just what is the competitive landscape there? Are you likely to see your patent infringed by local competitors? Are they capable of doing that? And then in addition to that, I would say there's a big strategic element to this. So the more patents you have per market, the greater is your ability to either exercise market power or trade those patent portfolios for other advantages. And so the strategic element to this is something that occupies IO, industrial organization economists. I think it's important. To me, it's kind of anecdotal at this point, but that's where I would say it's a mixture of all kinds of economic and strategic motivations.
Thanks, Keith. I haven't heard really anything about, and I can't remember the name. I should remember the name of this. Oh yes, patent trolls. So I used to work at the U.S. International Trade Commission, and we had this Section 337 area where a domestic patent holder could, or intellectual property rights holder could bring a case and argue that an importing product was violating this. And one of the big debates around that was patent trolls, collecting patents with the notion that you might be able to use it to extract some sort of economic rents without even actually, thinking about using the patent. At least that's my understanding. It's probably not a very very precise understanding. Any reactions to that in terms of making it challenging to understand the motivation?
Well, briefly again, and maybe Andy wants to jump in on this since he's right in that game, but I believe the phrase you're looking for is patent assertion entities, if I'm not mistaken. And, you know, I think they get negative reputations fairly easily, perhaps a little bit unfairly, but nevertheless they exist. And it's interesting you mentioned Section 337 in the I don't get too esoteric on U.S. patent law here, but or IP law. But, you know, since there was a change in the expectations about whether you should or circumstances under which you should issue a preliminary injunction in purely domestic court cases, there has, and that does not apply to the Section 337, as I understand it. So the ITC still is capable of issuing these preliminary injunctions off the bat. It does seem like there's become an increasing degree of enforcement through the ITC, Section 337, as opposed to sort of standard court procedures. And that does suggest that a fairly large motivation here is strategic. But I don't know, Andy, did you want to add anything to that, or am I wrong about that?
I don't think you're wrong. I'm not able to comment on the legal aspects because I'm an economist and not a lawyer, so I'm not sure if, on the legal aspects of that. We'll have to let the lawyers tell us. But you know, there's been a lot. I mean, obviously, the phrase patent troll is a pejorative phrase. It's a negative phrase. Patent assertion entity or non-practicing entities are typically the way we refer to them. And the reason is because they're not all bad. Actually, the research that's emerging does not suggest that these entities are really net negative. I know it's not a settled question, but the emerging research does not suggest that this is all bad. You know, remember Dean Kamen. Dean Kamen is the inventor of the Segway, that funny little vehicle with two wheels that people love to ride on when they go to tours, right? In all the big cities. Back when we were doing tours, we will do them again. Don't worry. But his company DECA would be considered to be a non-practicing entity because what they simply do is develop and license their technologies. They don't actually build anything in-house. So actually my conversation with him once, he was very frustrated with the current, this was a couple of years ago when this was super hot, the dialogue that he was having with the policymakers in Washington, D.C. on this topic. He was just very frustrated because, and he spoke at a Senate or a House committee hearing, telling them that, you know, I have a very valuable economic function that I'm serving, and I'm using the patent system to do it, and it's very beneficial to society. And to point to use these pejorative terms and to consider it to be all negative would be wrong-headed. And so, so that's kind of the way I think about this. I'm not sure about the legal aspects with respect to injunctions with the International Trade Commission. But I think that this non-practicing entity debate is largely about exploitation of the legal system, but the economic function seems to be not all negative. Let's put it that way.
Thanks, Andy. Karsten, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I just, since you're talking about patent assertion entities, just wanted to point out that in the area of trademarks, there is actually a phenomenon that in many ways is similar, the phenomenon of trademark squatters. That in a sense, someone files a trademark speculatively with the idea that another company might at some point seek that trademark, and at that point, the original company would sell it against a certain price. Mentioning that partly because I've done quite a bit of research on this, and I have a paper with Christian Helmers at Santa Clara University on this. But also, I mean, all the evidence suggests that this is becoming actually a more and more important issue. Maybe to tell an anecdote about this, at some point, we are receiving every year the statistics on trademark filings from intellectual property offices around the world. And at some point we noticed that trademark filings in Japan had really gone up quite dramatically. And, we sort of wondered what was going on there. It turns out there is a single individual, a former trademark examiner, in fact, who just files thousands of trademarks every year, speculatively, and he in fact, I understand, has an AI algorithm that sort of scans the internet for new words that are emerging, and then he sends these letters, cease and desist letters, to companies that potentially want to use these trademarks. And the Japan Trademark Office actually, has sort of warned about this particular character. Now, this is, and it's such a big phenomenon that you actually notice that, in the nationwide trademark statistics, which I thought, was quite remarkable. But the phenomenon exists everywhere. It exists especially in countries that have a weaker use requirement in trademarks. But even in the United States, that has probably the strongest use requirement in the world. You have sometimes problems with trademark squatting. So just to mention that, this is in some sense not only something that concerns patents, but also trademarks.
Yes, we've had that true with certain individuals in the past. I don't know to what extent that's still true today, but I remember there was a small law firm in Portugal that also used to file like hundreds of trademark applications here at EU IPO, which obviously had no real merit. And I would expect that that's probably less of an issue at the USPTO, given your very strict use requirements. But yeah, it's an issue.
Okay, thanks. I have a question. Could go to any of you. Duraj Duraiswamy asks, does TRIPS have any mechanism, either current or proposed, to deal with patent evergreening, which along with price gouging tends to have an adverse effect on consumers in favor of overzealous innovators in the pharma industry? A little bit loaded question, but anybody want to take that on? Does TRIPS have a mechanism, current or proposed, to deal with patent? Let's stop at evergreening, patent evergreening.
That seems like a legal question, that I don't feel qualified to really answer. I do know in the United States that, it's our patent law that the companies are following, and if the law allows another use to be patented for a particular drug, so that's not necessarily evergreening particularly, but they're following the law. So some of these practices that are coming under scrutiny need to be taken to the legislative folks to discuss, because the patents office, like I said, adjusting to Alice, we have to adjust to the law. When the law says computer implemented algorithms are no longer a patentable subject matter, but it must be significantly more, we have to figure out what is significantly more, what's that new standard, let's implement it, and now that's how we do our job. And there was a guidance to examiners to that effect. So that's the way the patent offices handle these kinds of things. I think that's more of a legal question.
Thanks, Andy. And I see a lawyer with a hand up, and we'll go to Keith first, and then we'll go to the lawyer after. Keith, go ahead.
Well, sure. Briefly, I mean, actually, Tony knows he can cite the entire agreement from memory, I'm sure. So, but
his hand is up.
I don't think there's anything in the TRIPS agreement that addresses this issue. In fact, I'm not even sure the issue was on anybody's mind at the time of the negotiation of the TRIPS agreement, but it does appear in some of the so-called TRIPS plus preferential trade agreements. And in that context, some countries have perhaps adopted regulations along those lines because they thought it was sensible for them to do so in the context of a trade agreement like that. But I don't think there's anything in TRIPS that would actually have sort of legal context to put that into.
Tony?
Yeah, I thought I'd better pitch it on this out of sheer duty, but I think Andrew and Keith have expressed it very well. And the way I'd phrase it is this, is that the agreement, well, first of all, evergreening is one of these loaded terms that really describes a spectrum of activity from outright abuse of the IP system to quite genuinely valuable incremental innovation. And the TRIPS really doesn't grapple with that question directly of what's the innovative threshold you need to cross to get a valid patent. That's often described as a TRIPS flexibility. For me, it's really part of the design structure that it's because patent law is by its very nature highly dynamic, highly responsive to technological change. The determinate, we know from some of the leading cases, the boundary between obviousness and non-obviousness, or inventiveness or lack of inventiveness, can be measured in months in some of the critical cases. So that's the first point. That are these truly legitimate patents, and is it a legitimate invention? And that's not something that you would want to hardwire into a treaty such as TRIPS. That's exactly where there needs to be a more responsive and dynamic situation, both in terms of the domestic law and the way it's applied by the IP officers and the courts. But so really the point is that it's not the kind of thing that an agreement like the TRIPS agreement would necessarily deal with in a granular fashion. The question is whether it has the necessary framework, whether within the principles of TRIPS you can take action against the abusive forms of evergreening, if you like, the ones that are clearly not consistent with the aims and objectives of the IP system, that really don't involve productive use of the patent system. And I think the answer is yes. I think that can be done. There's a number of specific points. I mean, it's how you define the inventive step in an applied way, in a practical way, in Article 27. And I think one of the lessons we have from 25 years of TRIPS is maybe not to focus so much exclusively on a top-down approach of what does TRIPS say, and that therefore is the law, that TRIPS is some kind of model legislation, which it just isn't. I think what we need to do now is learn from the practical experience in legislatures and in the courts as to how the key principles of patentability in Article 27 have been applied. And I think that's the germ of the response. However, the TRIPS agreement also does recognise there is such a thing as abuse of IP rights. That's not defined, but it's clearly referred to. That there's in Article 40, there's reference to anti-competitive licensing practices, which is not exactly the point here, although failure to license key innovations in the pharmaceutical area might fall into that category and might sort of overlap with ideas of what was mentioned, price gouging or evergreening. But there's also, curiously, a provision requiring cooperation and technical assistance, not only in building up IP systems, but also in managing the abuse of IP rights. Again, I'm just quoting from the treaty text. And where these are problems, I think the treaty is suggesting to us in several ways that this should be more of a collaborative exercise between international partners, at least at the level of mutual learning and possibly moving towards convergence. But I think it's the kind of practical issue that and a very dynamic fact basis you're grappling with, that it would be very difficult to hardwire it into a treaty, particularly a treaty that gets amended so rarely.
Thanks, Tony. I have one last question in the feed, which is, I think, a big question. It's got three parts, so I'm going to just cut to, it's from Moga Kamalyani. And I'm going to cut to the bottom line, I think. And that would be, is it possible? Well, what is the net economic effect of intellectual property rights for society? And if you want to bring that to this discussion, cross-border intellectual property rights as embodied in TRIPS. Does anybody want to take a shot at that? I've summarized the question rather tightly compared to the, so I apologize to Moga if I've misstated it, but I think that kind of gets to it. Anybody want to take that on?
Well, I can mention something that's so there's a professor at Northwestern University in Illinois in the United States. His name is Professor Daniel Spulber. And he has a book that just came out called The Case for Patents. And what he does is he brings together a lot of his prior writing about the role of patents in the economy, things like standardizing the technology, in the sense that when I communicate the technology to a potential buyer, it comes in a standard format called a patent. It's got certain parts to it. It's got claims and drawings, and this standardized way of communicating technology facilitates markets, trades, and transactions with respect to those technologies. And he goes to a number of other elements that really kind of highlight the role of patents in the economy. I imagine that many of those aspects would also apply to international transactions. But I refer the individual to that book because I think it's a great outline of the many varieties of ways in which patents actually do have an economic contribution to make.
Thanks, Andy. Moga corrected my mistake. He actually was interested, do patents, particularly around medicines, have a net positive health effect or a net negative health effect? Not so much an economic effect. So that's a difficult question since we're largely a group of economists here. But I do think it comes to this question, are more people better off because of the innovation incentive that patents give in the development of medicines versus, you know, the counterfactual, what if we didn't have patents and there'd probably be a lot less innovation? I think that would be the way to think about it. But does anybody want to try to answer that? Keith, please. Yeah.
Well, I don't think there is a clear answer to anything so broadly stated like that, but a few comments to think about in this area. You know, innovation in pharmaceuticals, if we're going to stick to pharmaceuticals, is pretty concentrated, like it is in most areas geographically. And the returns to that innovation are earned by a fairly small number of multinational enterprises that are themselves concentrated in their headquarters location. And so the question I think being asked here is does the intellectual property system relying on patents generate sufficient incentives both to create the kind of life-saving innovations that are helpful and does it generate more access, say in middle income and developing economies? And that's kind of the way I would phrase it. And there's no easy answer to that. I'll say on behalf of the system that I think since the TRIPS agreement was put in place and you've had this successive improvement in patent rights around the world, that the evidence we have from economists at least is that has raised the access and reduced the product launch times in certainly emerging economies, to some degree also in developing economies, so that those products become available more rapidly. And there isn't a lot of evidence yet, but I think there's a long way to go before we can say anything confident about this, that the pricing of these new products is fairly competitive. I mean, there's certainly an increase in average prices in places where we've been able to study it, like India. Having said all that, there's a lot we don't know. I mean, we don't know what's been happening to generic producers who are imitative in much of the developing world, and that's an area that really has to be looked at. And we don't know. And I guess I won't say we don't know. My sense is that the patent system itself generates private incentives to produce new products that are in great demand or will be in great demand in the wealthier countries. And it does not resolve the classical problem of neglected medicines or diseases that have high burden in poor countries, but there just isn't the market resource to pay for developing those medicines. So let me just complete this by talking for a minute about the COVID issue, which is the greatest example of these trade-offs we've seen, I think, since the TRIPS agreement. The AIDS problem 20 years ago is in the same category. I think the pharmaceutical industry learned a lot from the AIDS issue 20 years ago, and so they're probably, for various political and humanitarian reasons, more likely to be moving in the direction of widespread distribution. But they wouldn't have developed these drugs without substantial public resources devoted to the problem. And I don't myself see that the patent system itself is going to generate the kinds of incentives that are necessary to distribute these vaccines in bulk to developing and emerging economies. So long answer, my short version on this is, in some drugs, the patent system works well, in others, it does not. And when you're talking about a clearly global public good like vaccines for COVID-19, there needs to be an extensive public response that's coordinated internationally. And the TRIPS system doesn't, to me, really get in the way of that, but it's not terribly helpful for it either. It just takes a lot more work.
Okay, thanks, Keith. That was I think, quite a thoughtful and measured answer, so much appreciated. There are no more questions in the feed. We are losing participants as I look at the count. So if Tony doesn't mind, I think I'll wrap up the session. And thank you all for your excellent presentations and engaging in this conversation. And thanks for your contributions to the discussion around TRIPS at 25. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thanks. Very nice discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Everybody.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much for guiding us through.
Yeah. Sure. Good evening and good afternoon for our friends in the United States.
Bye, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.